So I think we'll just get started, and then anyone that's going to join can join. So welcome everyone to this webinar on existential risks to Bosnia-Herzegovina and the critical bridge of constitutional reform. It's part of a larger series that is really convened and organised by Aarif Abraham from Garden Court North Chambers and also acting director of the Accountability Unit, with help from the co-directors of the Manchester International Law Centre, myself, John Haskell and Ian Scobie, and also Philip Drake, the director of the University of Manchester's Justice Hub, as well as Dr Evelina Ochab, co-founder, and Jess Templeman, the trustee of a trustee for the Coalition of Genocide Response. And before I hand over to our chair, Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, who will introduce the topic and help us frame the discussion for this evening, I'm just going to give an overview of this webinar. So we'll first hear from our panelists about the main challenges and risks facing Bosnia-Herzegovina today. First from Dr Valery Perry, who has worked in the Western Balkans since the late 1990s, conducting research for a variety of different organisations, including the European Centre for Minority Issues and the NATO Stabilisation Force. And then from Amna Popovac, who has worked for international organisations in BIH, such as the European Union Administration of Mostar and the Office of the High Representative. And she will talk about the role of the international community and neighbours in prolonging conflict. Next will be Bojan S, who is a psychologist with vast experience in mental health issues, including mental health issues related to migration. He's on the board of the Academy of Sciences and Arts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and tonight we'll discuss the reality of the lived experience of Bosnians in the frozen political spaces post-conflict. Then we'll hear from Dr. Iva Vukušić, who is a lecturer in the Centre for Conflict Studies at Utrecht University, and who worked between 2009 and 2015 for the Sense News Agency in The Hague, covering trials at the ICTY. And tonight, Eva will consider the legacy of international crimes. We'll then hear from Professor Azra Zornic, who is a retired professor of sociology, and from 2004 to 2017, she worked in the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, previously worked in the Human Rights Chamber and in the UN Refugee Agency, and she will talk about the impact of failing to implement human rights norms. Finally, Aarif Abraham is a barrister at Garden Court North Chambers. We'll talk about the political culture and possibly more inclusive and participatory constitutional future for Bosnia. And we will open it up to discussion and to question and answers. So please do use the Q&A or chat function throughout. So I will hand over now to Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, who are very pleased will chair this webinar. He's practiced as a barrister since 1971, and he worked at the ICTY between 1998 and 2006, where he led the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic, former president of Serbia. He's worked in numerous cases in connection with the ICC and worked pro bono, and we're very pleased to hear, well, from all of you tonight in your specialisms on this topic. So without further ado, I will hand over to Sir Geoffrey Nice.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lesko, and I should be quite short, not least because I prefer to hear what others have to say, but also because it's some time since I've really had much detailed experience of Bosnia, nothing in detail since the failed attempt, with which some of you will be familiar, to revise the 2007 International Court of Justice judgment in the case brought by Bosnia against Serbia. Of course, before that, I was involved in the ICTY, but that gives you a somewhat slanted or narrow view of what's really going on, and I'm not going to pretend that I have other than the narrow view of the outsider. There's another reason for being fairly short now, because I expect many of you, certainly I'm sure all the panelists, but maybe many in the 35 number watching so far, will have read Schmidt's report to the United Nations issued a couple of days ago, which pretty well explains the dire position that is facing Bosnia-Herzegovina at the moment. I would try and frame the present problem then from my narrow perspective and particular viewpoint in the following way, which will not appeal to some. It seemed pretty clear to me, dealing with, I think, 3 different trials, which themselves had different views at the ICTY, that the greatest harm was done by Serb forces. That what happened in Srebrenica was an extraordinarily wicked act and ought always to have been recognized fully as such. What happened with the trial process was arguably that the tribunal tried to be too fair in ensuring that every possible view of the conflict was dealt with, which had, I suppose, arguably, as a consequence, that every single possible view of the conflict is still outstanding and unresolved, arguably not to the benefit of anyone. It is worth remembering, although of course in no way comparable, but just worth remembering, that when I went to university 19 years after the Second World War, nobody talked about the war. Nobody was interested in it. Nobody talked about human rights or the Human Rights Universal Declaration. Couldn't care less, because it was all behind us. And there had been a clear and unequivocal victor and a clear loser and criminal loser, however unfair that victor's justice view of things may have been. And so it continued, and both sides were able to make progress. There are completely unresolved issues in Bosnia, and their lack of resolution, it seems to me, is one of the real problems that's leading to the present very unhappy position that one experiences, at least I experience, whenever I go there, because unlike my experience after the Second World War, every conversation in Bosnia, but also in Serbia and in Kosovo, focuses on conflicts 25 years ago. Every film is based upon it. The question, and that is what I'm sure speakers will be dealing with in part today, is how to move from this unhappy state of excessive memory. And so we go now to Valery Perry, I think.
Okay, thank you. In my limited time today, I'd like to make 4 main points to build on what Geoffrey just noted. First, for the past quarter century, Bosnia-Herzegovina can best be described as existing in a state of frozen conflict. Now, what does this mean? Basically, the same political territorial agendas that characterized the war continue to motivate elite-level decision makers. And these issues are not good governance, accountability, human rights, the rule of law, anti-corruption, or economic opportunity, but quite simply, which political party controls which piece of land. The theory behind the Dayton Agreement that ended the war was to stop the fighting and then provide space to incrementally improve the quality of the democratic system and life for the people who were trying to start to rebuild. Over time, this would help to transform the country from one characterized as a negative peace into one that could be more confidently described as positive peace. And this was happening until around the financial crisis in 2008. There had been reforms made or started in areas of public life and administration, ranging from the judiciary, defense, intelligence, and taxation. We also saw improvement in other sectors as well. And this was achieved primarily by the citizens of the country who are working to rebuild the country and to prepare a foundation for a better life for them and for their kids, their children. But it was also helped by an international community that had and was ready to use both carrots and sticks, the main carrot being the promise of transatlantic integration, most notably through the EU. However, in the past 12 years, we've seen not only a decline in the quality of engagement, but even regression of achieved reforms. And this brings me to my second point, that international support for the progressive improvement of governance, quality of life, and rights has been replaced by a very transactional and values-free appeasement from the top down. This has been evident for years, but has recently picked up speed, as you may have seen in recent coverage, including recently by the BBC, The Guardian, Politico, and others. We've seen, for example, Milorad Dodik amping up his rhetoric about the secession of the Republika Srpska. Dragan Čović, in turn, is amping up his calls for a de facto Croat entity, dusting off and doubling down on a well-worn playbook. And yet we're again seeing coordinated appeasement by countries that should know better, as recent talks on election law reform or constitutional reform are being supported, pushed, and legitimized by the EU, US, and UK, and would in fact reward these agendas. Some will claim that this analysis is incorrect and that these reforms will deliver real and quality change. However, this is really a cynical exercise that's about power allocation formulas, plain and simple, to solidify a system in which parties choose their voters rather than voters choosing their representatives. And while proponents like to reference Switzerland and Belgium and South Tyrol as models when speaking about a further ethno-nationally aggregated BIH, they're really selling fog. They should be noting Lebanon. The results of the appeasement of domestic political agendas with an international policy of pacification, all in the name of stability, leads to the operationalization of frozen conflict for clientelistic self-dealing, reinforcing tribalisms that then in turn continue to feed the conflict. This creates an intentional negative spiral of polarization and societal decay. My colleague Kurt Dessiner has called such cases peace cartels, a term that aptly captures the dynamics at play. The question now is whether the repercussions will be one of a slow bleed of continued demographic decline, or of escalation and intentional and top-down polarization could lead to violence. This brings me to my third point, why this matters. At a time when democratic self-confidence is at a low point on both sides of the Atlantic, and when illiberal systems can often seem to be on the rise, it can be tempting to relegate Bosnia as a problem of the last century. However, this is faulty logic. Bosnia matters because of its location, its leverage, and its people. In terms of location, it's been fashionable to note that geopolitics is back, that in light of a pivot to China and to better focus on hybrid war threats from Russia and others, that the Western Balkans needs to be finished with the tick box checked. Yet one can tie the future of the region to the notion of a global battle of ideas, of a democratic vision versus an authoritarian one. And it's in precisely BIH and the region where a committed and values-based strategy and policy is needed to counter opportunistic spoilers seeking to increase illiberal influence on the Balkan Peninsula. Failing to do so is essentially allowing an own goal. Why have we failed to appreciate and use this leverage and opportunity? And why haven't we sought to regain the democratic self-confidence that helped to do so many things right after the war, rather than retreat and throw up our hands? It's been a missed opportunity, plain and simple. And until recently, for all of the challenges, there was the belief that the countries of the region, Bosnia included, had a future in the EU. And yet if we're unable to support these values in Europe, where there is not only interest but leverage, one can be legitimately worried about our abilities to promote these values further afield. Finally, it's easy to lose sight of the people in Bosnia-Herzegovina who have now lived through more than a generation of war and the post-war experience of negative peace. Faced with a bad set of options at home, they're increasingly opting to just get out and move to Europe or beyond. Even people with jobs now no longer see a vision or future for their children. Once abroad, they live and thrive amidst far more heterogeneity than ever possible in a country now shaped by ethnic cleansing and weaponized homogenous life. That is perhaps the saddest and most ironic outcome of these political dynamics. Human assets are being stripped away from communities where many people would like to stay, yet feel forced to leave. In conclusion, this situation we find ourselves in today was not and is not inevitable. Regular people didn't want war in the 1990s, and it was top down. And in fact, it took a lot of brutal effort to work. What's unfortunate is that solutions, and I'm using that word in air quotes, continue to be sought from a top-down actor level, which is the level least interested in unfreezing this conflict and trying to build a positive peace. And I'm very happy that there's a number of people on the panel today who will be able to demonstrate that there are bottom-up efforts out there that should be embraced, because those are the people who should be our partners, not the elites who have failed to embrace change for the past quarter century. Thank you.
Perfect. That was bang on time. We're now going to hear from Amna Popovac.
Thank you. I will talk about the role of the international community and neighbors in prolonging conflict and alternative political futures. International community played an important role in the region since the 90s and many times failed to fulfill its role properly. One could say that international community, instead of focusing on progress to build functioning state, was focused on stabilization. Now we see that concept of stability before democracy completely failed. Lack of full implementation of the Dayton Peace Agreement brought us to the place where we are today, divided instead of integrated society. In addition, the concept still present in the Serbian and Croatian political establishment that creation of the unique state is something unacceptable, something that would lead to the supremacy of only one nation, Bosniaks, actually Muslims, made the implementation of the Dayton more difficult, if not impossible. Current trends of the public statements by some political leaders in VNH, supported by Serbian and Croatian political establishment, indicate an effort to roll back reforms implemented since the end of the war. Bosnia-Herzegovina nowadays have serious problems related to its functionality, the rule of law, and the VNH institutions. They negotiate with self-proclaimed national leaders who have neither the legality nor the legitimacy to decide on behalf of the citizens. In this way, they give them legitimacy and create the impression that they are really representatives of the people, while forgetting that all three national parties together won about 25% of the vote in the last elections. Instead of letting opposition and the people to replace them in the elections, as opinion polls shows a drop in the support of national parties, their imposition of the laws can be enforced, and sending their envoys to the BNH urgently only give importance to the alleged leaders and help fix their ratings. International community should recognize that the type of reform that is needed is not solving a frozen conflict, but frozen state capture. Europe and the US have taken an inadequate approach to obstructions and criminality in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Restoring independence to the judiciary and strengthening the rule of law are the key to the BNH future stability and success. Greater support to the High Representative in BNH is important, and not only for the strategic political issues, but most importantly for the economic ones. We must get the social economical policies adopted into our parliaments. If not, full support to the High Representative to impose laws is needed that will help our business community. They are being strangled with the taxes which are being spent on big salaries of politicians, instead of being given as incentives to our small and medium companies. At the time when 16-year-old teenagers of all nationalities across Bosnia-Herzegovina are talking about whether or not we will have another war in BNH, there are no preconditions to talk about constitutional and election law reforms that would lead to a functioning state. And let me be clear, there are no preconditions for the conflict in BNH now. But nationalist leaders are threatening with the secession and the war to hide their multiple corrupt practices, especially during the pandemic, importing respirators that kill people instead of saving lives, or using technical oxygen to treat COVID patients. Instead of accommodating nationalistic interests that would lead to further division of the state and making impossible state institutions to function normally, we should keep election law as it is and focus only on limited, meaning technical changes in it. That would lead to correctly counted votes and minimize electoral fraud on the next elections in October 2020. Only after that, we could focus without pressure and war trumpets on the proper constitutional changes and election law reform. That, together with reinforcing rule of law, could bring lasting peace to Bosnia-Herzegovina and the region. This is all what I wanted to say.
I think you're still on mute for Geoffrey.
Sorry, I was still on mute. Thank you, Amna Popovac, and now it's over to Bojan S.
Thank you. After the war in the 90s, Bosnia and Herzegovina has been caught in a transition in the wave of various reforms, much of which was conceived far from real participation of citizens or their understanding in general. For instance, what the people believed used to be a high-quality education on all levels before the war now ended up being transformed into something that manifests with very low scores on the program for international student assessment and similar appraisals of students, with the reform of universities also being far below expectations. The years, now decades, of exposure to foreign influences, first throughout the war, and now with the almost esoteric diplomacies, such as those we witness these days, with Russia and China strongly opposing their interests to the views of the Western forces, motivated by things actually probably unrelated to Bosnia and Herzegovina, leaves the citizens of this country with an impression that they are the most passive participants of their own lives. Increasing poverty, steering away from the sense of values in which knowledge and intellectualism would be held in highest regard, betrayal of trust on which people relied, which ends feeding mistrust and the sense of victimhood, as well as therefore a general disempowerment, is what is easily seen in the psychology of Bosnian people nowadays. Citizens resort to binge watching of lowest imaginable quality TV programs, primarily various reality shows, and gambling is exceedingly popular as an imagined means of escape from looming poverty. Loss of sense of agency is prevailing in most domains of life, and perhaps most self-sabotaging when it appears in the form of abstaining from voting. Agency among the young, but even among those who are not so young anymore, can be seen practically only when it comes to motivating oneself to emigrate. The overall post-war atmosphere has led to a profound change in the citizens' attitude towards this country. While during the war, people left Bosnia, most of them hoping to return eventually, now Bosnia is leaving them. This time, with this reduction of identity, they are most often choosing to emigrate, now with an intention never to come back. The current political situation builds an atmosphere of fear of a new war, and this is something even the children in schools discuss these days, reflecting the views of the parents who may have personal memories of war, sometimes of returnees who probably regret ever returning. All this is going on in a country where the current politicians, or so-called leaders, an appalling misnomer, choose to keep things that way through control of the media and omnipresent corruption, thus keeping the normal and progressive citizens of Bosnia in a deadlock. Such progressive layers of the population, their views and ideas of how to change Bosnian society away from the backward trends brought about by the nationalists, are kept hidden from view and often atomized, also left without funding opportunities to actually organize and oppose the ruling class of war profiteers. But these people are there, quite probably actually being a majority, and in desperate need for a boost, perhaps external, that would enable them to save themselves and the country, which has had a history of centuries of tolerance and peaceful relationships, including a glorious anti-fascist past in the Second World War. I'm grateful to the organizers for the opportunity to address this esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bojan Ćosić. And I think it's now Dr. Iva Vukušić on whom I can call.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm going to somewhat shift gears and talk about accountability and war crimes prosecution, something that, of course, Sir Geoffrey Nice is an expert on. So I want to say that the key takeaway from my comments is that going forward, the situation seems bleak. Really bleak when it comes to prosecuting alleged perpetrators of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The OSCE said at the end of 2020, there remained a backlog of 571 unresolved cases involving 4,498 suspects. So in light of the recent crisis, we have to remember that many perpetrators, in fact, walk free, and that deterrence does not seem to be a very powerful force when it comes to preventing future crimes. In this current context of these increased tensions, I think this is important to know and to remember. No system can prosecute everyone fairly and expeditiously in the aftermath of widespread violence and war, and some will always walk free, but the missed opportunities in BIH in the past decade, I would say, are staggering. And we can go back to this in the Q&A. So to expand a bit, I want to make 3 points where we were with war crimes prosecution and accountability, where we are, and how to improve. And my perspective, I suppose, comes from working as an analyst at the Special Prosecutor's Office, Special War Crimes Department of the Prosecutor's Office in Sarajevo in the late 2000s. So where we were back in 2007 and 2008, when I lived in Sarajevo and worked at the prosecutor's office, there was a lot of hope. There was struggle, but there was also hope. We were organizing better, we managed our work better, and we really had a feeling, and that was the reality of the situation. The investigations were going, there was a certain momentum. The progress was under the leadership of the head of the department then, Mr. David Trendeman, and things were really improving. So 15 or 12 years ago, there was a sense of momentum, a sense of sort of hope. Now I would say there isn't. And if one reads reports about accountability and prosecutions in the region more broadly, but especially in the Bosnia-Herzegovina, I would say there is not a lot of hope right now. Political will, external interest and pressure, attention, funds have been drying up since, basically. And unless there is immediate action and attention, I'm afraid things are going to grind to a complete halt when it comes to war crimes prosecution. Second question, where we are. So the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, of course, closed. And now the mechanism, the daughter institution, is finishing its last trial. It's in a state of appeal. So there is actually very little attention also there to the issue of accountability as it relates to the former Yugoslavia more generally, but also especially Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we're really lagging behind on domestic prosecutions. There is a small number of indictments, there are delayed trials, dying suspects, dying witnesses, and of course, COVID has exacerbated these delays because it was not possible to hold especially larger trials in court. Any previous strategies to advance and in fact complete war crime trials have blown deadline after deadline, and making these documents essentially completely meaningless in any substantive way. We now have a new temporary chief prosecutor, but as far as I can see and read, there is no indication that the situation is going to change in any significant way. And finally, how to improve. So external actors like the EU and the US, of course, should start paying more attention to war crimes prosecution again, the way it did 10 or 15 years ago. As key aspects of a broader rule of law agenda. And nothing will change without political will and external pressure. Nothing will change if that doesn't come. I would say a good start is to read and implement recommendations given by experts. For example, Joanna Corner, who is a former ICTY prosecutor from the UK and has been recently elected as a judge at the International Criminal Court. So to conclude, I would say this is a wake-up call to renew commitment to dealing with the legacy of widespread wartime violence seriously, because it's not only about the past, it's also about the present, and it's about the message that impunity sends to those contemplating potential violence in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vukušić, and a very clear line taken on the value of prosecutions, which maybe we'll explore skeptically later. And now then it's Professor Azra Zornic, I think, who has the good fortune to come before we hear from Aarif Abraham.
Thank you. Let me tell you my story. I, like my fellow citizens, have had the bitter experience of having others defining me and in turn limiting my rights and dignity. When I went to the Montenegrin coast with my late husband in 1998, a customs officer at the border looked at our passport and told my husband that he could cross a border and that I could not because I have a Muslim name. We had to go back and look for another border crossing because we already had a reservation at the hotel. During the war in besieged Dobrinja, Sarajevo, the Muslim charity Merhamet distributed a small amount of coffee for humanitarian purposes. When it was my turn to get coffee, they said no coffee for me because I was married to a Serb. I could cite many, many more similar examples of discriminations by name. I emphasize that my husband did not identify himself as a Serb, nor do I as a Bosnian. We were only citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Like my father and grandfather, I was born in Sarajevo and have lived there all my life. As all citizens of BH, I feel discriminated against and experience that my dignity is trampled upon in all aspects of life. The institutionalization of a system that would bring the country and its people to this point compelled me to take my case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg in 2005 to petition for my right to run for the highest elective office, the presidency, as a citizen of BH, without an ethnic label. Only in July 2015, the court found in my favor. I have no political ambitions in terms of running for and participating in government at any level in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What drives me to further this legal struggle is the goal of multi-ethnic civil legally regulated states. Contrary to the Convention on Protection of Human Rights, the BH Constitution gives preferences to the collective in relation to the individual. It deprives every citizen of the right to run in election of BH. So I did everything ambassadors have been calling on citizens to do for 25 years. I saw rights being violated, then prepared the case, worked through the BH courts, went to the court in Strasbourg. As a citizen, I did everything I could at the time. There are many young people who are well educated, enthusiastic, and full of new, fresh ideas how to create a new social contract. Why aren't the diplomats supporting people like us? The United States and its allies should take a proactive role in aligning the BH Constitution with the Convention. The way it works now is inadequate and insufficient. Agreeing to the blackmail of Russia and China discourages citizens in their efforts to take concrete steps to amend the constitution and the election law in accordance with the convention. The citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina are confused, frightened, worried, and disappointed. They are confused by the action of the international community, which supports and rewards the destroyers of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They are terrified of the news of war and dissolution of BH, and they are worried and disappointed with the actions of the United States, UK, and the European Union. Citizens are especially concerned about the UN Security Council's concession to Russian blackmail over the non-recognition of the OHR and High Rep in BH. Regarding the escalation of the situation, citizens' opinions are divided. It is clear to everyone that the current political establishment does not have a quality socio-economic program and vision for the future of BH, and that they are trying to compensate by using ultra-nationalist rhetoric in their election campaign. The solution for Bosnia and Herzegovina, in my opinion, are therefore amendments to the constitution, but those that will abolish discriminatory provisions for all BH citizens, and this applies not only to the presidency of BH, but also to the House of People of the Parliamentary Assembly of BH. It is quite certain that Bosnia and Herzegovina will face a very turbulent 22, which will be burdened by the attempts of political parties to benefit themselves and their party representatives, and not the interests of the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Zornic. And before I call on Aarif Abraham, and unless I misunderstood the system, Dr. Lythgoe, at the moment, open questions and answers are empty. Is that because you're storing them up and going to release them onto us right at the end of Aarif Abraham's contribution, or is it because nobody has yet asked a question? Because if they haven't, then they better get started with it. And since I can't see them all and pick them up and ask them to answer a question, I shall probably turn to Evelina Oshab as the first person I can get to ask a question. But let's see what happens if that little Q&A thing can be filled up. Let's hope it does. Aarif, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. I'd like to put forward 7 propositions and 3 points by way of conclusion. My first proposition is that the Bosnian constitution was a domestic and international elite-led process. The consociational model they created and implemented was intended to be elite-led and to the benefit of elites, and that remains so today. My second proposition is that the consociational model, by which I mean having particular features of power sharing and group autonomy, was predicated on the idea of ancient ethnic hatreds and the inability unwillingness, or incapability of the Bosnian people in all their diversity to be conciliatory, moderate, and accommodating, unlike internationalized elites. My third proposition is that proposition 2 is false. The statistics demonstrate, and I have looked at time series data in detail from the late 1980s to the present day in my book, that actually the Bosnian people, including its 3 majority ethnic groups, have as democratic a political culture as, for instance, Britain's, and in fact, more diverse and more democratic a culture than neighboring Croatia. Now, that is not exceptional. It goes back to a variegated, diverse, and multi-ethnic past stretching back over 1,000 years. In fact, when political culture in Bosnia is operationalized, denoted by markers of political participation, political apathy, and latent participation, Bosnians, generally speaking, score better across time in almost every category than neighboring Croatians. They remain accommodating, tolerant, and willing to live with the other, and have particularly high latent potential for democratic engagement, even if they are or have reason to become momentarily apathetic. My fourth proposition is that despite Bosnians' good political culture, and I accept it was better 5 to 10 years ago than it is today, that the Bosnian people remain critically locked out of the political process, given the structures set out in its constitution. There is a wide discrepancy between elite political preferences and the preferences of the people. My fifth proposition is that every major effort at Bosnian constitutional reform has failed. Each of those efforts have been elite-led, and most of the proposals have tended towards greater and debilitating entrenchment of ethno-nationalist elite interests, segregation, or orientation toward group rights over individual human rights. The people, in any popular sense, have had no involvement in the constitutional reform space. For example, NGO-led initiatives have tried their best, but have no real agency or platform with which to counter entrenched and powerful ethno-nationalist interests for a number of reasons, but primarily because of the constitutional structure. Now, regardless, I do not take any position on the content of reform proposals, but rather the way they have tended to be the lowest common denominator as they have. My sixth proposition is that proposition 5 creates high political apathy towards state institutions, parties, politicians, and immediate political participation. Parties are the least trusted of any institution by the people, but paradoxically and in contrast, there remains great potential for larger popular engagement, reconciliation, and long-term participation. The data shows Bosnians demonstrate remarkable propensity for non-political engagement, an interest in politics, and membership of non-governmental organizations. Some examples of this Bosnian agency were the Justice for David movement, the plenum following the floods and protests in 2014, and so on. My seventh and final proposition is that prospect theory and game theory allow us to model popular and elite preferences. And the modeling suggests, as I've undertaken, that properly institutionalized and with procedural safeguards, inclusive, participatory, and deliberative processes can allow novel processes for reforming the current constitution. Now, these processes are completely overlooked by policymakers, partly because of outdated thinking about mechanisms that allow for greater civic involvement and input, such as calibrated referenda, civic initiatives, and deliberative assemblies. So my first conclusion is that it is possible to incentivize local elites and nudge them into reconciling their preferences with the avowed preferences of the people. This would mean providing greater civic input into a system that was not designed for it originally, with some safeguards. Such civic involvement would not entail creating a single constitutional moment, which can lead to crisis, but rather intertemporal bargaining through repeated constitutional interaction by every generation. It would mean no departure from the status quo unless and until some genuine civic involvement is made a possibility. Second conclusion is that any current reform proposals which allows for greater ethno-nationalist or group-oriented entrenchment would be highly misguided. I accept that there may be local grievances because one group has more rights, so to speak, than another, but the answer is not greater group rights. All the modeling for Bosnia shows and the precedents for this internationally, Lebanon is one, is the inevitability of breakup if there are concessions toward group rights without fundamental reform elsewhere to deformalize and delegitimize group rights generally. The breakup scenario, which we've talked about, is being furthered by active predatory neighbours and powerful foreign agents. So my conclusion is that given this predicament, a revolving constitution may provide, and I say and it is only a possible way out for Bosnians themselves. A revolving constitution, for instance, could subject parts of the existing constitution to greater civic involvement and input, referenda, civic initiatives, deliberative assemblies. This input, particularly an extra-constitutional deliberative assembly or convention, would be on a fixed and regular basis so that people can determine what, if anything, should change. The high-level principles governing such an arrangement would be set out in a constitutional covenant and accepted critically by all relevant entities, cantons, and municipalities. And that could formalize the process for a possible deliberative assembly on the current constitution. Failure to agree any amendment in this assembly would maintain the status quo. Failure for subsequent ratification of any amendments concurrently and jointly in all the cantons and all the municipalities would also maintain the status quo. So essentially, the people would be no worse off than the status quo. The process would guarantee that the outcomes of reform would accord with the median voter. And as I've demonstrated, this median voter, the evidence suggests, is more accepting, more tolerant, and more democratic than the elites are able or willing to be within the current constitutional framework. Finally, I need not convince anyone with even limited knowledge of Bosnia of the need for constitutional reform, and the key points of departure relate to the extent of any reform. Can piecemeal and partisan change be effective, or is a complete and radical overhaul necessary? And critically, is there a middle way? I am advocating for a radical middle way, not my way. I don't seek to have any say in the content of constitutional reform, but I do suggest a way that necessarily entails the involvement of all of the Bosnian people. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Aarif. And it's good to see that we have two questioners already, one who's asked two long questions and one a shorter one. And Robert Hayden's long questions include the following proposition. The positions taken by the participants in this webinar are endorsed largely by unelected elites. What is the source of their own claim to legitimacy? I'm going to come to Robert Hayden's question second, after dealing with a question or asking a question from Carolyn Edgerton. But I would just notice, as I'm a self-professed outsider and no expert, a question that any one of you might like to answer at any time in the remaining 40 minutes. And the question's a simple question. Of course, looking forward, you shouldn't always look back, but maybe you can occasionally look back to ask the question, is there a single thing that has led to this dreadfully unfortunate, unhappy, and dangerous position? If so, what single thing is it? And I'm just going to give you a list for you to think about. Is it Greater Serbia? The 19th century and onwards continuous plan still with us, although the prosecution of Milosevic never used the term, witnesses did. We referred to all Serbs living in one state. Is it the desire of the international community not to have a Muslim state in the heart of Europe, something that is evidenced in a number of different ways? Is it Dayton? Is it the present constitution? Is it the choice to have had the ICTY attempt to deal with these matters in a criminal way at huge expense? Money could have been spent elsewhere, might, if ever possible, a truth commission have been a better way out. So there we are. You can answer any of those questions if you get a chance. Carolyn Edgerton asks this. Clearly, the EU transitional justice model for BH is inadequate. Several of you have made that point. The current model doesn't address the economic crime, corruption, and transnational crime that hold the country back. So what should be the shape of the new model? What is going to work? Who would like to answer that?
I can try at least to get us started. I just want to say thank you, Carolyn, of course, for a very good question. From my perspective, I think in challenges such as those faced by Bosnia-Herzegovina in the aftermath of such a brutal war, is that whatever policy you have is going to be difficult to implement, and it's going to face its own issues. So I don't think we can expect a situation where transitional justice works beautifully and things are resolved. From my perspective, the critique that I was delivering, I think my point is that it wouldn't have worked perfectly, but there was progress being made, and the existing strategy and the existing plan of prosecuting people at the ICTY, but also domestically around Bosnia-Herzegovina, had it just been implemented better, would have worked better. So for me, it's not a matter of principle as much as trying to implement what was already there. Simply the attention and sort of the commitment to war crimes prosecution domestically has fallen off the agenda. And I think that's my crucial point, which is not to say that that should be the be all end all of transitional justice sort of policies, criminal prosecution. Of course, there's many other things we can and should be doing, but I think we were on the right path, and then it just sort of, wasted away. So that would be my start, I guess.
All right, now who would, and you haven't specifically answered Carolyn Edgerton's point, you can, but would anybody else like to deal with that? Because it's a recurring issue in conversation, I think, from my own experience. Amna Popovac.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Eva, I would disagree with you, because I think that any court proceeding on any court decision could not bring us reconciliation. And reconciliation is done actually among people on the ground. So people, we don't hate each other. I'm a Bosniak Muslim who survived the war in West Mostar because my Croat neighbors stood in front of Croat guns and didn't allow us to be killed. And all my friends before the war, Serb, Croat, Bosniaks, stayed my friends during the war and after the war, and we all survived. So this social network is still alive in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but we don't have politicians on power or guys who are running this country. We have mafia on power, and you should tackle this issue like Italy tackled mafia. We have to first establish rule of law. We have to start solving these corruption cases, like, but properly. We have to have good prosecutor, couple of them with good salaries protected, plus good, honest judges, and to start this process of cleaning our society from within. And I think this is what is really needed first here, and then it's a process. No one can guarantee anything to us, but people, we don't hate each other. People are afraid of the war. People are not ready to go into the war. People will do everything to prevent it or leave before it starts. So when you hear this war trumpets and all that, it's all just for the purpose of covering or hiding crimes, criminal, or this stealing money from the budget. So we need to first do that. And also regarding the democracy and voting, we don't know how we are voting, because our voting system or counting votes is corrupt. Whenever you open the bag, there is a huge discrepancy between how people voted and what is on the paper that are that are counted ballots. So that's why I'm pushing more first for these small steps, technical changes in election law which could be done without changing any law. Just the Central Election Committee and the OSCE and various international organizations can push for that. First, let's see how we are voting, because only 25% of us all in total are voting for nationalistic parties, and they are representing themselves like they are representing people, which is not true. So I will stop there.
And before we move on to the second question or to extracts from those submitted by the second questioner, does anybody else want to deal specifically with the topic that is raised by Caroline Edgerton about transnational crime of various kinds and that absolutely need dealing with?
Yeah, I'll take a crack. Yeah, sure. I'll take a crack at that. No, I mean, I think she's right. And I remember being at a conference shortly before the pandemic began, where it was interesting when one of the speakers was talking about transitional justice in a broader way that would also include social and economic issues that fed from the war. And while I thought that was a useful exercise, I think that both are necessary, but in sort of complementary and separate paths because they're very different legally and in terms of the crimes. But I think it was a very good question and way to think about these issues. And thinking about, I mean, economic crime, corruption, and transnational organized crime reminds me that, again, this is not just a domestic issue. This is a security issue. And even though people in Germany and in Sweden and in Austria, regular voters, don't care at all even about genocide. They don't care about crime, but they do care if they find out that the drugs that are being sold in their quaint little Austrian town are coming up through a criminal pipeline from Afghanistan down through the Balkan Peninsula, through all of these different layers of syndicates. And again, there have been tons of efforts to try to work on this, etc., but it really can't be entangled. I did a lot of work over the last year looking at some of the theories put forward by the journalist Sarah Chase, who makes a distinct and explicit link between state capture and corruption and extremism, violent extremism and polarization. And she makes an excellent case looking at 5 different countries. And then a team of colleagues and we did the same looking at some countries in the region. And it was a very useful exercise to recognize that these things are all interconnected. And that actually makes me think about Geoffrey's initial comments when he was posing whether or not there's any one original sin that we can look at. And all of the ones he mentioned are certainly valid. But what I started writing down when he was saying that was, I'm often asked, well, what one thing would you try to do to sort of fix the post-war reform process, etc.? And I always cheat by saying, well, okay, I want 2 things. And I say, well, first of all, I think one of the biggest mistakes made was the selection of an election law that promotes polarization and actually requires it. There are and there were models for the elections at all levels, state, entity, canton, municipality, on the table that actually would have promoted moderation, rewarded cross-constituency campaigning, etc. But for whatever reason, the absolute worst option was picked to force people into the corrals and to force people into their identity boxes. And it's very interesting for me now to see that in the United States, some of the very same polarizing bad practices are now being implemented more there. So unfortunately, we're not learning from each other. The second thing I think that was an original sin was the support for complete and utter Wild West privatization when there was no rule of law, because that actually is what created a system of oligarchs, which we're still dealing with here. And we had already seen this play out in the former Soviet Union in the late 1980s, 1990, 91. So already then people knew shock therapy would not work in the absence of a rule of law structure. And so that ties into the whole socioeconomic question completely. And I think that's why there's a lot of diplomats who know this, but they're not allowed to really talk about it. They can't say that, capitalism failed, and they can't say that the system's not working, but they're not stupid. They know that these drivers happen and that they played a part in it by supporting this without question. And there's the third comment I want to make is related to another question in the questions there about, well, hey, why do we care? These people voted for these guys, And I've been hearing that for years. I mean, someone actually, a colleague of mine, John Hulsey, actually wrote an interesting piece called they voted for these guys again, because we've been saying that forever. And it is an interesting question, but it's also a question that the intent of which is to blame citizens for the straitjacket structure that Dayton put them in by saying it's their fault that they voted for these people, without recognizing the day of fraud that Amna has already mentioned, but also the broader structural imperatives. I mean, if you're in a small town and your husband has a job for 800 KM a month at the factory that the party runs, big surprise when you're going to vote for that party, even though you'd like to do something else. People have to feed their families. And I find it really offensive, actually, when people will say that people here must be so stupid.
Dr. Perry, thank you. I'm going to just cut in for a second.
Fair enough. Okay.
And I'm going to tell all the panelists that I'll finish early enough for each one to have, providing they've edited down, 1 minute of closing observations, 1 minute only, to make sure that you don't feel you've been shortchanged if you don't land up answering one of these interesting questions. But let's deal, first of all, with the third question of Robert Hayden, and then the second one, and see where that takes us. His third question says this, of his first question, that it noted that the leader of all these communities are popularly elected, point that's just Valery's just been making, repeatedly by the people who they supposedly do not represent. Why has no mention been made by any panelists of the position taken by the elected leaders of the Croats and Serbs, which doesn't include Kumsic, who got few Croat votes? But his substantial second question, I'll read it fast because the panelists have got it, and I'm sorry, the audience, if it's too fast. He says the Dayton Constitution didn't freeze the conflict as stated. The conflict continued with ethno-territorial division of the country that was begun during the war, largely completed after it. According to sociologist and former member of the presidency of BIH, Mirko Pejanovic, in a 2017 article, the data shows there are almost no municipalities left with populations as heterogeneous as they were in 1991, and current demographic data shows that there are almost no mixed marriages, which was what was frozen was the Dayton structure, as well as the idea that the country had some kind of inherent tradition of peaceful coexistence, which is only true, says Robert Hayden, if we disregard 1835 to 56, 1875 to 78, 1914, 1919 to 20, 1941 to 45, 1992 to 95. Aarif, some of this is directly focused at you, so we'll take someone else first. That is assuming anybody else is inclined to deal with this interesting question. If it's not Aarif, I'll give you 4 minutes. 4 minutes, Aarif, and others can come in.
I'm not sure if Professor Zornic wants to say something, but I'll be quick.
Oh, I missed that. If I did, then...
I think Professor Zornic might want to say something before.
Okay, Professor Zornic first.
Just shortly, to reply to Mr. Hayden, he is not right at all. He should come and live here in Bosnia, especially in Sarajevo. There are lots of mixed marriages. How do you call it? Yes, they are mixed, men and women, but in a religion, a connection to religion, yes, there are so many mixed marriages. It's still, that process is going on. We are raised as a citizens, normal, especially in the cities. Maybe smaller rural municipalities be ethnically cleared, but the cities are still mixture of all citizens. Mr. Hayden, you are not all right. Come and see by yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zornic. Aarif, I think you're getting your 4 minutes, but it's no more.
Sure. Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. I mean, I've had a look at Professor Hayden's questions. I also had the benefit of seeing a slightly longer elaboration of his question earlier. I mean, it's quite clear that his position isn't based on any evidence. I've spent almost 150 pages of my book assessing the question of political culture. I've identified what is the theory behind various models of political culture. I've set out in detail operationalizing political culture itself. So how do you transition from theory to practice? I've then looked at that operationalizing of political culture and applied it to both Bosnia, and as a local comparator, I've applied it to Croatia. And on every single marker of participation, Bosnians score higher on democracy, on attitudes towards tolerance, on attitudes towards living with others, on attitudes towards participation in political structures, on attitudes towards liberal economic regimes, than neighboring Croatia, which is now an EU country. His position that as a consequence of the war, you have these demographics. Yes, you have these new demographics. You have a lack of return of refugees, yet notwithstanding that, Bosnians still maintain on every single measure of democratic and political participation a far more democratically oriented culture than neighboring Croatia, and a culture as good as Britain's. So I think it's a question of, as Wittgenstein said, whereof you have no knowledge, thereof you must be silent. And I suggest that he takes a real close look at the evidentiary basis, which I've set out, statistical analysis looking at the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey, as well as the historical basis for arguing for a variegated and multi-ethnic history of Bosnia. And just on a simple example of mixed marriages, Sarajevo had the highest rate of inter-ethnic marriage of any state in Europe pre-war. So this idea that mixed marriages, a lack of mixed marriages today, is somehow exemplifying a lack of tolerance or a lack of shared living or shared history is a complete misnomer.
I'm sure that Associate Professor Hayden would want and is more than welcome to continue contributing to the written discussion, but he will want to look at, let me interject, I have no interest one way or another in the outcome of any of these issues. I was only looking at things from a forensic point of view. But one of the most interesting things was to look at the pre-conflict and post-conflict demographic maps, which showed a complete scattergun of colors of majority Obstemas from Croat, Serbian, and Bosniak. And it's very hard to believe for a simple outsider that if you've got people completely mixed up, they are not, in fact, going to get on tolerably well. If you then look at the post-war map, you see exactly what was achieved by the Serb onslaught, which killed and moved people, so that I dare say now there are no mixed marriages because people have been moved into the positions where majority populations are allowed. Feel free, please, Professor Hayden, to answer any of these points, but I now ask the panelists to see if they have anything else they would like to add on his comment. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to add on all this that even nowadays we have 1/5 of population of Bosnia-Herzegovina that lives in the places where there are not majorities. So we are still mixed, not like before 90s, but still mixed. I live in a Mostar that is divided on east and west, Bosniak and Croat side, and we have kindergartens, primary, secondary schools separate for Croats and Bosniaks. But when it comes to the faculty, when children need to decide whether they will go for engineering or medicine or something, then they have no problem. We have even 2 universities, that is one Bosniak and the other Croat, but professors are working on both. And children are choosing according to their preferences of their what they want to do. So they are not considered, oh, I'm a Croat, I will not go to the Bosniak university. Well, they'll go because it's IT and they will get employed immediately. Or so there is This division is only imposed and emphasized by politicians, while on everyday level you have people cooperating and working without problem. And also in Mostar still we have mixed marriages. They are not majority like before, but still no problem in that. In everyday life, ordinary people, politicians, it's about controlling money and keeping status quo as long as possible.
Mr. Zornic, you haven't yet spoken in the discussion. Is there anything you'd like to add on this?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Amna just said and what Professor Zornic has also said. This is entirely true. The concept of coexistence is an actual misnomer. And whoever was immersed in this society before the war or after actually realizes that to the fullest. To be a minority here is a question of where you are now with the displacements that have been caused by war. This is a fact, of course. We do understand that there have been massive migrations and that the map in terms of ethnic coverage of or proportion of each of the groups in certain areas differs when compared to what used to be before the war. But this does not affect the issues of, as many would believe, or what was raised already, reconciliation. It's already there. People do not feel belligerent. They don't resent other groups as such. There is an actual divide which is more and more felt now between the poor and the rich, and between those who are in power to a vast degree unjustly, and who reached that power through mechanisms that Dr. Perry magnificently described very clearly. So these are not really the burning issues of what Dr. Hayden calls coexistence and what we in Bosnia call life, living here.
Thank you very much. I see there's a question for me, but rather than indulge myself by answering it now, though I'll try to Saifuddin Hodzic later if I get time, there's a question directed to Valery Perry. Answer please swiftly, because you've had quite a lot of airtime already, from Hikmet Katic, and it is this. Orban is visiting Banja Luka. To what extent is the far-right population in Europe having an influence on the current events in Bosnia? And I can't see it, it's off my screen. Something about last demographic survey summit was held in Bosnia when Orban, Vučić, and Dodik and others attended. Comment, fairly quick.
No, I mean, yes, you're right. I think that this is just another step up in the escalation of the far right in the region and globally in terms of its own networking. And I only hope that these examples of stochastic terrorism, because it really is creating an environment in which you radicalize a population towards an idea so that they can be turned on or are turned on themselves in terms of lone wolf acts of violence, to basically then lead to a conflict and then claim that it was always inevitable. And I hope that that we can start to raise as much attention to this variant of violent extremism as we saw focused on other variants of violent extremism over the past many years, because they're all the same in terms of their method, their modus operandi, and their intent in terms of dividing and regressing society. So, but you're right completely, Hikmet.
Anybody else? Thank you very much. Anybody else on this one? In which case, I'll read out Saifuddin Hodzic's question to me, but I'll throw it open to others first. What kind of approach would you advise citizens of Bosnia-Herzegovina to take in order to initiate and/or implement key principles from the draft Articles of Responsibility of States for internationally wrongful acts, explained by quotation, no state shall recognize as legal the situation created by serious breach of peremptory norms of international law, nor shall render aid or assistance in maintaining that situation. States shall cooperate to bring to an end such breach. Second half of the question, would you advise initiating a special resolution to the same effect at the Security Council or UN General Assembly? Thank you, Saifuddin Hodzic. Who would like to deal with that before I say such things as I might add? An abundance of silence. Come along now.
If I might reframe that just a little bit to say, because I noticed a theme through everyone's talks as well, where there was a desire as well for the US, Europe, or the UN to get more involved again. So maybe if we could almost reframe this, because I mean it's up to the will of states, right, as to whether or not they could we could implement the international law mentioned. So what kind of actions or activities would you like to see the UN Security Council, the US, Europe acting together or individually take in order to kind of help the situation? Just because it came up in quite a few talks, and it's quite interesting because usually a lot of the discourse that I've read on Bosnia-Herzegovina was, well, now we need to allow agency of the citizens and agency of the domestic parliament to survive and to succeed. We need to have courts speaking to the people, and we need to get rid of all this foreign interference. So what I found so interesting about so much of the talks earlier was a desire to bring it back in. So if I might link that into the question and abuse my privilege as chair to ask
no abuse. Thank you very much. Who else would like to contribute? Before I have my say, if I do, I might. All right, well, my view or my answer to this is not specifically to the draft Articles of Responsibility of States, but to accept the underlying principle and to pick up perhaps on Dr. Lythgoe's observation, but in another way. It is possible to argue that the citizen should be less and less trusting of and reliant on the intervention of either states or international organizations, because they're basically not to be trusted. And the citizen needs to understand and accept that, which is why I'm rather doubtful about the value of international criminal courts and would rather see some kind of open admission system. Sorry, Dr. Vukušić, but that is the way I generally feel. And so for Bosnia-Herzegovina, it seems to me, and this is not just because I was party to the corrupt non-attempt by President Bakir Izetbegović to launch a revision of the 2007 revision in early 2017, but more generally, it can, I think, be argued that what has gone wrong is that the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina have not made it their mission to set an accurate history themselves. You can't possibly expect the international community to do it for you. For example, at the ICTY, there's the very clearest evidence, not as Professor Hayden would want us to believe, contrary to Serb interests, but actually for Serb interests, because the prosecution policy was often aimed at serving Serb interests and contrary to others. The recent Kosovo court arguably shows, that's the specialist chambers for Kosovo, shows the same thing. You simply can't trust international organizations to do your history writing for you. And if you get the history right, it is at least possible that the way forward will become clearer. So it's very unfortunate that the 2017 attempt at revision of a very clearly flawed decision in 2007 should have been put right. But much more generally, it seems to me, in answer to Saifuddin Hodžić's question, much more generally, what needs to be done is for the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina to say, we're not that bothered with what you're doing because you're not trying that hard for us. We don't trust you. We will tell you what has happened. That really needs to be set clearly outside the parameters of international courts. We will tell you what happened, and we will say what we wanted. And when one hears, I know this is a supposed duty to have balance, which, what is it? Involves having climate change deniers given equal time to climate change activists. Thank goodness that policy has disappeared. There is an absolute duty. There is no absolute duty to hear naysayers of what the true history for Bosnia is. There is a duty for the historians and the lawyers, insofar as they're any use at anything, the law occasionally, and the history less often. There is an absolute duty to set the history right, and on the basis of the history, to look forward. And in the view of some, and I'm one of them, and sadly, no fault of the people of Bosnia, possibly of their leadership, that process is not being done. I said you'd all have 1 minute. You have. Who'd like to have their minute first? I think Dr. Vukušić, because I've had such a go at you, I think it ought to be you, really.
As a historian, I'm here to defend our colors. So let me say this. So war crimes prosecution, in my view, matters to remove murderers and rapists from the streets so that the survivors don't see them on the way to the supermarket. It also matters to send a message about what kind of behavior is allowed in society. I don't think we can just say, let's forget about it and move on. So trials are by no means the only solution, of course not. But I think they're part of a solution, coupled, of course, with prosecuting corruption and other more restorative transitional justice measures. I don't think trials reconcile anyone. I don't think they're designed to do that. They don't write one narrative. Again, that's not what they're designed for, but they're still valuable. If in nothing else, they put some bad people, in prison, and they collect an enormous amount of evidence, as you, Sir Geoffrey, well know, about what had happened in the past. And I think that's incredibly valuable, no matter of the outcome about who goes or doesn't go to jail. Thank you.
Thank you. Amna Popovac, how about you next? You're mute, I think, so perhaps.
Yeah, I'm muted myself. So I think that really we need to start working on inclusive processes in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the international community shouldn't be doing using double standards in working in Bosnia-Herzegovina. If they do not negotiate with the party leaders in their country rules and the new laws and constitutions, they shouldn't do it here. So we are normal people, like any other people treat us like that. We are not people with special needs. We are just living in the captured state, and help us to remove this mafia on power, and then there are still enough healthy people and healthy knowledge in the country to move things forward. We don't want to go and live into Germany or other Western European countries. We would like to stay here and live. We just need a proper system that is working. We like systems like any one of you, and help us establish that system. But do not exclude us, as you said, do not exclude us from making our own laws, history, and future. That's all.
Thank you. Bojan Šošić, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, well, I would briefly return to the question you posed earlier, Sir Geoffrey, about is there a single thing? And I would briefly say there's never a single thing. Like with the airplane disasters, many things have to coincide in order to things go the way they are. And this is exactly the situation that we are dealing with now in terms of the requirements that we are being set before us. yes, I agree, there's so much to be desired on the part of the Bosnian intellectuals, historians, scholars, politicians, leaders, call them whatever name you choose. But also in terms of wanting to be part of a civilized planet Earth, humanity, we need to see that there is congruence in allowing for certain conditions that are beyond our reach to be met. We cannot handle those who still advocate the polities of the Greater Serbia, or if they choose to call it a new name now, because that's not our job. But there needs to be someone else who will say, this has led to something that was really wrong with the entire continent, at least, and let Bosnians deal with what they can. Thank you. I enjoyed the evening.
Thank you very much. Aarif and Valery in reversal, in that order. And so you've only got a minute each, and I'll shut you up when you're done.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. I mean, I should declare that I have no affiliation to any group in Bosnia. I also have no desire to see any particular amendment to the constitution. I guess my interest is, how do you achieve evolutionary outcomes in the short run in a country? Evolutionary outcomes which tend towards the rule of law, to democracy, to human rights. And I think that's my interest, is that we're not imagining a Bosnia here. We are reorienting towards a Bosnia which existed, one that was based on unity and diversity, shared living, human rights, democracy. And really my suggestions orient towards that, so that Bosnians ultimately themselves can have a meaningful say in their own future. Thank you.
Thank you, Aarif. Valery.
Sure. I guess I would just close by saying that, again, what happens in Bosnia-Herzegovina is a security issue and is a part of a global values struggle that we are seeing. I think it would be good for everyone to review the Copenhagen criteria that used to be used to sort of determine whether or not countries were ready for EU membership based on human rights and other principles. It seems we've forgotten about that, thinking it's only an economic exercise, and that's wrong. And in terms of the people, whether citizens of the region or people in the neighborhood or outsiders who have engaged in this issue, I guess my main question would be, why would anyone want to root for Bosnia to fail? I mean, that's what I don't understand. When Aarif has explained as well and demonstrated, it has the recipes for success. Anyone engaging in or on Bosnia-Herzegovina should really be contributing to a broader arc of progress and civilization, as opposed to hoping for any sort of an essentialist tribalism that really does not represent what people want. And I hope that we can contribute to that. So thank you for the evening.
And rather than end it myself, I would actually let Dr. Lesko, who may want to correct almost everything I say, have the last word. Sorry?
We still have Azra to give her 1 minute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Have I missed someone? Oh, yes, I have. Oh, my goodness. Please accept my apologies, Professor Azra Zornic. I'm so sorry. You're now mute. My lack of manners has muted you, Dr. Zornic.
Oh, yes. Okay. Now, I just would like to say to everyone, participants and the others, there are, I said previously, but I am repeating myself, there are enough young, well-educated, enthusiastic people who are ready to work on the constitution or on the new social agreement, which is suitable for all citizens. And they have a plan to start from lower to upper, from the municipality to higher levels. So in that way, that young people might need all help, through funding, through and NGOs, helping them to bring the idea on the top.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I apologize for not having turned to you before. As I said, I will allow Dr. Lythgoe to have the last word, and I'll confine my observations, which are supposed to be in some way a summary, probably to the indulgence of the following, I think, 3 points. The first of which is that I do not think, from my limited outsider's knowledge and consideration of matters, that anything like enough attention has been given to the determination of the non-Muslim West to avoid there being a Muslim state in the heart of Europe. It features in all sorts of places, and quite probably in the abandonment of Srebrenica by the Western authorities in 1995, and probably in the period leading up to it. The second thing is positive, and the third will sound negative, but isn't. From the contributions tonight, there is an enormous amount of thinking for the positive good and reflective of actions being done and realities on the ground that are very much for the positive good, as they have been throughout the history of this country, if we are able to disregard Professor Hayden's narrative and accept the evidence narrative of Aarif Abraham. The third point, the unhappy point, is a point that I've made before, as long ago as 2015 at a conference in Sarajevo. But it is a comment that needs to be considered by the people of Bosnia, given all the surrounding circumstances, however, in Western parlance, unfair they are. And it is this, that the outside world cares about Bosnia and Srebrenica, but not that much. Time has moved on. People cannot be forever looking back. There are other tragedies insofar as there's a percentage of people's time available for the consideration of others' misfortune. And this reality, sad or awakening though it is, means that the positive forces that exist, as all speakers have shown, have to be activated by Bosnians themselves to deal with the unhappy and dangerous present circumstance that they face. Dr. Lythgoe.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists and to our attendees for the interesting discussion that we've been having this evening. I hope that this isn't the end of the discussion. I wish we could have a nice reception to continue the conversation, but I'm sure this won't be the end of it for sure. I hope everyone that's been watching has enjoyed our discussion, and I just want to give a huge thank you to Sir Geoffrey for his excellent chairing and framing of the debate. And I also want to do a personal thank you to Aarif Abraham, because he really convened this event and convenes the series generally. We're hoping to do a book launch of his book at the end of this month with the Manchester International Law Centre, so I can circulate details to that. And so this is one of many discussions in this series. The Garden Court North Chambers, the University of Manchester International Law Centre, and our Justice Hub, the Coalition for Genocide Response, and the Accountability Unit are putting together. So watch this space for more details. So I just, for now, thank you very much for this interesting discussion and engaging evening, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you.